What is your word worth? If you give your promise that you're going to do something, do you do everything you can to deliver on that promise? Or is your word a little bit more malleable? Do you believe that maybe promises might be, just kind of something that you might do? Do you believe that our nation should have a solid promise or this wishy-washy promise? I, for one, try my best to be a man of my word. And if I cannot fulfill my word for some reason, I do everything I can to make it right. But what about our nation? Our nation, the word of our nation, is vital to our national interests. Our dollar is backed by nothing more than the full faith and credit of the United States, which is effectively our word. It's not backed by gold. It's not backed by anything other than we say it's worth that, so it's worth that. Our promises to our international partners are worth nothing more than our word. If we make an alliance with the United Kingdom or with France or with Japan or with South Korea, our word is all that binds us to it. Yeah, the piece of paper doesn't do much for us. It's what we believe that matters, what we feel about our honor and our dignity that matters. Now, full disclosure, I come from a relatively conservative position. I'm not a big fan of war. I'm a big fan of economic security. I'm a big fan of things like securing our border on the south so that we can make sure that drugs and criminals aren't coming across, and our immigration system should be only allowable to those who are here legally. That there are things that we should be doing to advance our economic interests in this nation, including energy independence and security. That we ought to be a technological leader in the world, that we should be absolutely fulfilling our commitments both to our international partners and to our people domestically. I also believe that our government is too large. That said, we pay a lot for our government. We should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. There is no reason that our government cannot take care of the people in Maui, in East Palestine, and on the border at the same time as fulfilling our international obligations, because the United States is the greatest nation on earth. So that's my full disclosure there. Well, let's roll back the clock just a little bit. In 1991, the Soviet Union began to collapse in on itself. It had been a slow roll. It was working its way this way. I was a young kid at the time. I was in my teens. And I remember many of the things going on. The Berlin Wall had fallen not too much before, and there was a whole different atmosphere sweeping across Europe. Russia was no longer able to basically hold up under the burden of trying to keep up with the United States. Now remember that our perception back then of Russia was not only that it was a huge country, but that it had a huge population as well. So we always thought that we were outnumbered, outmanned, outgunned. That was our mindset at the time. So, 91 comes around, the Soviet Union collapses, literally becomes a black hole that sucks itself all down together and destroys itself. And out of that comes Russia, the Russian Federation, and several satellite countries that have managed to break away, one of which was Ukraine. Ukraine at the time was a technological hub of the former Soviet Union. They were making advances in tank design, weapons development, all the good things that technology would bring to the Soviet Union as a whole. So this is one of their technological hubs. However, Ukraine didn't want to be part of the now Russian Federation, so they broke off, had their own, own type of whatever constitutional convention or whatever it was, and ended up becoming becoming Ukraine. Well, one of the other side effects of their technological position is that they also held a fairly large number of nuclear weapons and the delivery platforms to put them into, well, enemy territory. They were, as I recall, either the third or fourth, but I'm pretty sure third largest nuclear power in the world after the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union. They had that many nuclear weapons. It was the Russian Federation, the United States, and then Ukraine, as I recall. The UK and France don't actually have that many nukes. They do have some. I'm not saying they don't. I'm just saying they didn't have a lot. So, Soviet Union falls apart. Ukraine declares its independence. It has the third largest nuclear stockpile. But what it doesn't have is all of the nuclear codes and programming information and things to make those nuclear weapons a productive weapon for them. That was all held in Moscow. So they're sitting on a pile of nukes. The U.S. is all about non-proliferation at this point in time. So we sit down with Ukraine and we grab Russia and we all sit down. The U.S. doesn't want Ukraine to have nukes. Russia doesn't want Ukraine to have nukes. The Ukrainians are sitting there, and to be brutally honest, at this point, they are dirt poor. And they don't have much of a military. All they have is this enormous stockpile of nukes. So we're talking with them, and our worry is that they're going to end up in the wrong hands rather than necessarily, being used as weapons per se, but that ill actors might get their hands on them. So we say, okay, look, we know who's in charge of the Russian Federation. We know they've already got a huge stockpile of nuclear weapons. So take these nukes, give them to Russia, and all the stuff that delivers those nukes, and we will, and this is called the Budapest Memorandum, and we will, as a nation, provide with some security guarantees. There was some hemming and hawing on this one. The U.S. really didn't want to have a full-on, legally binding, we must march our armies into Ukraine if there's any threat to their borders. So we came up with kind of a weaker version, which is basically that we would guarantee their sovereignty, and the methods thereof were left pretty vague. So that's 1994. Ukraine gives up their nuclear weapons. They've got some pretty vague security guarantees from the U.S. Later on, I believe it's the UK and France kind of signed similar things with them to guarantee their sovereignty. All's well and good. Ukraine, however, was a former Soviet republic. They had the Russian mindset, for lack of a better way to put it. And they were actually pretty tightly tied still with the Russian Federation. So that means corruption. Lots of it. But we come forward, and in about 2014, as I recall, there is a bit of an uprising. It's called the Euromaidan protests. And president at the time of Ukraine, I believe it was Yanukovych, tries to crack down on this hard. And what that ends up doing instead is it causes the Yanukovych regime to fall. Fresh elections are held, and a pro-Western government is elected. Around this same time, well, there's something called the Little Green Men. They show up in Crimea. Now, Crimea is kind of an unusual case. Yes, they have the Crimean Tatars. They're the native people of Crimea. They've kind of been an independent mind rather than necessarily Ukrainian or Russian at this point in time. The bit of information here, though, is that Sevastopol, because I've got to get the Ukrainian pronunciation down. Sevastopol has been a military base for Russia for a long, long time. In fact, it's on lease from Ukraine at this point. That also means there's a lot of ethnic Russians who were brought there as part of the Russian military. So it's percentage-wise, they are the largest percentage of Russian people in the area of Ukraine. So it's a simple matter for the little green men to come in, and they're basically Russian special forces and things like that, take over because they already had a lot of their people in places of power anyway. And even though by percentage they still wanted to be part of Ukraine or independent, that meant that there was no real fight back. Ukraine still didn't have an army to speak of. They were in no position to do it. And at the same time, roughly, there's a lot of things going on at the same time. Some people in Donetsk and Luhansk all declare their independence, which Russia, of course, doesn't send in any troops. Later, they admit they sent in troops to fight and hold these two separatist regions. Now, those areas, they were primarily Russian-speaking, but they were not, as far as I understand, the politics is a little murky because at this point the details have been lost to time. But there still were mostly, as in a slightly higher than majority, willing to stick with Ukraine. So again, same thing. There's enough Russian-speaking, enough Russian influence there that they basically pull this off. We've now got the two separatist regions and Crimea. Here's the thing. Our memorandum said that we were supposed to be providing for the sovereignty of Ukraine according to their 1991 borders. So we're already in a bad situation. Ukraine's not in much of a condition to fight back. But Russia just stomps in, they get their thing done, they've got their areas, and they hold still. And so everybody else is kind of like, oh, naughty, naughty Russia. You're naughty. You shouldn't do this. But, okay, fine, whatever. We'll deal with that later. They do their sham referendum, all that kind of stuff. So the Russians have already broken the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. We are on the hook for providing for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty on their 1991 borders. But we don't do anything because, Ukraine's not doing much of anything. But Ukraine spends the next several years building up their military capabilities and kind of have a low-intensity conflict going on, trying to retake the breakaway regions. They've pretty much given up on Crimea, at least at this point in time. Then 2022 comes around, and Russia has said to themselves, we broke that Budapest Memorandum, and nothing really happened. Ukraine's been getting to be a little of a thorn in our side, but we're pretty sure that if we march in there, that we'll be treated as liberators, and it'll be another fait accompli. In fact, we'll take Kyiv in 3 days. Everybody will celebrate us as liberators, and everything will be wonderful. We'll take Ukraine, and we'll have opportunities to reconnect with the Transnistria breakaway region. We'll have full undisputed control of all of this territory. It'll be ours entirely. Well, Ukraine in 2022 was not the Ukraine of 2014. They fought back. And they made the most of everything they did. In fact, reversing the tides. So that kind of brings us to current. Now, the U.S. and much of Europe has provided a lot of military assistance. All well and good. But we're coming up on a situation now where there have been a lot of calls to stop all aid to Ukraine. And a lot of this is being driven by Russian propaganda. Now, I don't believe that most of those people realize they're being driven by Russian propaganda. But that is what's going on. And we come back to this issue. What is our word worth? If we don't provide for Ukraine, and that's somebody we have a written document that says that we will provide for that. That doesn't mean we have to put troops on the ground. But you know what? We got a whole lot of military equipment that's basically ready to retire that could be easily just boxed up and shipped. So even if all we did was provide hardware and ammunition, Europe would be happy to provide the finances. In fact, at this point, Europe already does. The amount of dollars that we provide is small compared to the amount of euros, in this case, Europe is providing. So what is our word worth? Are we a nation of our word? So let me tell you what happens if we're not. What do you think North Korea's reaction would be after all these years of being basically held back because they were worried the U.S. would hold to their word? What do you think is holding China back from crossing the Taiwan Strait? What do you think is holding together much of this Western world that we live in? What does Japan have to gain by continuing to trust if we won't honor our word? So the question I have for Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, Jim Jordan, Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, all those who have been declaring that we will not send one more dollar of aid to Ukraine. I've never heard you say, do we keep our word as a nation? Do you live in a nation, all of you, that doesn't keep its word? I guess we're going to find out. And that's everything for today. Thank you for joining me. I do realize this is a little more of a different topic for me, but I would love to hear what you think. Send me a note in the comments below. You have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next video.